to work on doing the review for Honors Advanced Algebra Chapter 13C. I'm going to tape it in little chunks. I'm going to do the first two on the first video, second two, and so forth. So for this first video, for the first page, all we're trying to do is find our A, our B, our C, and our D values. So the first thing you got to do is you need to look at the original equation, and the first thing that I see that there's a 2/3 here. So I am going to rewrite this as y equals. That floating -6 I'm going to put at the end, so I have a 5 sine, and then I need to pull that 2/3 out. When I pull the 2/3 out, the theta gets by itself, the subtract, the 4 pi over 3 is divided by 2/3, or we learned that you could multiply it by 3/2. So the 3's would cancel, the 4 and the 2 would reduce, and in my equation I could write 2 pi now, and then I'm going to put that -6 behind it. If you want to think about it, if you take 2/3 times 2 pi, does that give you your 4/3 pi? That's a way of checking. So now my amplitude is 5, my period is 2 pi, again divided by 2/3, and again if you want to you could multiply that by 3/2, and that would be 6 pi over 2, which again it just turns out to be 3 pi. And then my horizontal shift is at positive 2 pi. And last but not least, my vertical shift would be -6. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing here. Notice that something needs to be factored out. So I have y equals -3 cosine. Factor that 5 out, and I'm left with a theta plus a 2 pi, and then plus 2 stuck on behind it. My amplitude is always a whole number, not -3. The negative sign means there's a flip behind it. Your period is 2 pi divided by your B value, which is 5. So it's just 2 pi over 5. My horizontal shift this time would be a -2 pi. And my vertical shift would be +2. So that should just be getting you kind of into the A, B, C, D, finding all of those pieces of information. So now we're going to start to do some graphing. And with the graphing, this, as you can see, doesn't write real smooth, so I'm going to do my best. You should have an idea of what they look like. So this equation, the 2 doesn't need to be factored out. My amplitude is 3. My period is 2 pi divided by 2, which is just pi. And my horizontal shift, there is none. My vertical shift, there is none. This means that I start at 0 on my graph. So from 0 with a length of pi, these are going to be tiny little numbers in here, but that's okay. Pi over 2 would be my center, and then pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4. That would give us the first wave. That's what we're supposed to graph all the time. Then I need to go backwards. I need my -pi, -pi over 2, -3 pi over 4, and -pi over 4. Those would be the spots that I need to add in for my points. Now, I always look at my vertical shift. The vertical shift is your D value. There is no vertical shift, so everything is based off of the x-axis or the yellow line, and I'm going to be very consistent about putting that in. So we're doing a cosine wave. A cosine wave starts at its highest point. If you are going to be kind of guessing at what that highest point is, label it for me. I know that that's 3. Then I come down, I hit the yellow line, and I'm also supposed to hit -3, back to my yellow line, back to my highest point. That's a cosine wave. And I would repeat the process. And now I'm going to try to draw that in with this pen. It's sometimes hard to hit my points. But that would be my cosine wave. So when I grade this, just so you guys know, you're going to get 1 point for your x values. You're going to get 1 point for your heights, making sure that you went there. You're going to get 1 point for labeling your boxes, and you're finally going to get 1 point for your shapes. So don't forget that you can, even if you goof up on these, you can at least get the rest of your points for that. Okay, so that's our first graph. So let's go on to our second graph. Second graph, nothing needs to be factored out. My amplitude is 1/2. This is going to be a little itty bitty wave for height. My period is 2 pi divided by the b value. There's no b value, so it's 2 pi. My horizontal shift, though, is pi over 2, and notice it's positive pi over 2, and I have a vertical shift of 3. So what does that mean? It means that I am starting at pi over 2. That means I'm going to end at pi over 2, my phase shift, plus my period of 2 pi, and that would mean I'm going to end at 5 pi over 2. So that's my first wave. The other wave that I'm going to deal with would be pi over 2 subtract 2 pi, which would turn out to be -3 pi over 2. Let's deal with the first wave. I'm starting at pi over 2, and I'm ending at 5 pi over 2. So I'm kind of talking to myself. There's a nice middle. I can see it. It's 3 pi over 2. 2 pi over 2 would be this. Oh, I could have labeled that pi. And 4 pi over 2 would be 2 pi. So that's one wave. So then I'm going backwards. Here would be -3 pi over 2. Its middle would be -pi over 2. And -2 pi over 2. And again, if you wrote -pi, that's okay. And 0. So I'm switching colors. I'm doing, my vertical shift. My vertical shift is up here at 3. So that's what I'm basing everything off of. So when I draw in my wave is supposed to go up 1/2. So I am going to label, this is 3.5, and it's supposed to go down 1/2. I'm going to label 2.5, so I know what my heights are supposed to be. So sine wave. Sine wave starts at the yellow line. Notice I start at pi over 2. That's my starting point. It hits its highest point at the next point. At 3 pi over 2, it would be back. At 4 pi over 2, it's down at 1/2. And at 5 pi over 2, it ends. That would be my sine wave. Now coming from the other way, at -3 pi over 4, it's at its lowest, or it's at the middle. At 2 pi over 2, back at -pi over 2, at 0. So my sine wave would look something like that. So let's go on to page 2 and continue graphing these things. Again, I look to see If there is anything that needs to be factored out, there's not. So this has an amplitude of 2. My period would be 2 pi. My starting point this time is at negative pi over 2, and there is no vertical shift. So at negative pi over 2 is where I'm going to start. So here's my starting point. So what do I have? For my ending point, I have pi over 2 plus 2 pi. Oops, and this is a negative pi over 2 plus 2 pi, which would mean I would end at 3 pi over 2. So 3 pi over 2. Now again, you can see there's a nice middle. There's pi over 2. And this would be 2 pi over 2, or just pi, and 0. That's my first wave. The other wave, if I take negative pi over 2 and I subtract 2 pi, means that it would be at negative 5 pi over 2. So negative 5 pi over 2. And again, you can see negative 3 pi over 2 is the middle. 4 pi over 2 would be there, and negative 2 pi over 2 would be my next point. So I look at my vertical shift. There is no vertical shift. So everything is based off of the x-axis, or my yellow line. This is a sine wave. So for my sine wave here, and it doesn't have a flip, it starts on the yellow line. It hits its highest point, which should be up here at 2, back to the yellow line, hits its lowest point, which should be negative 2, and back. Starting again. Starts at the starting point, highest point, middle, lowest point, middle. And should look like that. Again, if I had a regular pencil, it would probably look a little smoother, but that's what we've got. So, on to number 6. Amplitude is 2, period is 2 pi because there's nothing to hook out. Notice that theta doesn't have a parenthesis around it, so the horizontal shift, there's none, but the vertical shift is negative 2. So if I'm starting at 0, I'm dealing with pi over 2, pi, 2 pi, or 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi would be my numbers that I'm going to deal with. And let's put in my negative 3 pi over 2, my negative pi, and my negative pi over 2. I need to do my vertical shift. It is at negative 2. So everything is based off of that yellow line. So when I put in my cosine wave, my amplitude is 2. That means I'm coming up to 0 when I'm starting, and then I'm going to hit the yellow line. I'm going to hit the bottom line, that would be 4, back to the yellow line, and end at the top. So again, top, middle, bottom, middle, top. So my cosine wave would look like that. And finally, with this last one, nothing to be factored out, there's nothing hooked onto it. My amplitude is 3, my period is 2 pi, and it would actually be divided by that 2 over 3, or multiplied by 3 over 2. So it turns out to be 6 pi over 2, or 3 pi. I just did a lot in my head. It has no horizontal shift, it has no vertical shift, but there is something that I need to notice here. What I need to notice is this is a secant, so I am really graphing cosine for my first round. Okay, so let's deal with our starts and our ends and that. I'm going to start at 0. Life is good. I'm going to end at 3 pi. So if I look, this line right here would be the middle line of that. That happens to be 3 pi over 2. Now there's not a nice middle here. In between those two lines would be my middle. If I do my trick, add the tops, 3 pi, double the bottom, over 4. And the same idea here, between these two, there's not a nice middle, it's going to fall here. Now, if I'm adding my tops, remember this is 6 pi over 2. So 6 and 3 make 9 pi, double the bottom, over 4. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, those 4 additional points from my starting point. Same thing going backwards. Here would be negative 3 pi. So here at negative 3 pi over 2, it would work. At the halfway point between those would be right here. That would be negative 9 pi over 4. And last but not least, in between those points would be negative 3 pi over 4. So those are my points. No vertical shift, so, oops, switch colors. So everything is based off of that x-axis there. I am going to put in a cosine wave. My amplitude is 3, so I know I need 3 and I need negative 3. So it's going to hit my highest point, my middle point, my lowest point, my middle point, and I can't count down here. Oops. Erase. Erase. This is let's see. It would be 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So I hit my lowest point, back to my middle point, and my highest point. And my middle point, my lowest point, my middle point, and my highest point. Now, again, I try to make this look like a nice cosine wave, but I'm drawing on a little pad, having it read it to the paper, so it doesn't always draw that nice. So that's my cosine wave. But now I need to put in my asymptotes. My asymptote occurs every time the graph touches that yellow line. And these are supposed to be straight lines. I usually try to make them dotted, but it's really hard on this thing to make it dotted. It's really hard just to make a straight line, let alone a dotted line. So every one of those black lines is an asymptote. Now, remember your hills and valleys. Here's a valley. I need a hill, and the hill has to touch that region once. So here would be a valley. It's coming out and it's hugging those asymptotes, and here would be a hill. Now, I can see that this is part of a hill, so I'm going to make half of a valley, and I'm going to make half of a valley. The red is your secant wave. So this is the first 2 pages. I'm going to stop here, upload, and then you can click on to the next section. Hope that this helps.